My name is Robert Teester, and I've been a psychotherapist for over 36 years, and I've been a meditation teacher for over 12 years. This is a part of a series of talks that I'm giving called The Cultivation of Wisdom. And this talk is on the psychology of addiction. When you talk to people about addictions, they oftentimes think of their own, or they think of the common addictions like alcohol or drugs and so forth. However, in the broader cosmology of the psychology of addictions, we turn our awareness back onto the mind itself and see how the mind creates attachments, and it creates routine behavior, which eventually become addictive in nature. If we want to avoid something, we can create in the mind some behavior pattern that will avoid or distract us from what is important for us to attend to. So, for instance, if we have some kinds of feelings unpleasant feelings, that maybe there's some hurt there, some pain there, some embarrassment, humiliation, all kinds of uncomfortable feelings, we oftentimes can turn to drugs or alcohol, and if you watch the movies, this is a very ingrained form of addiction, or form of anesthetizing ourselves to our actual feelings. And there is very little role model for, particularly in the film and movie video area, where people actually go into their feelings directly and talk them through and feel them. In the normal traditional addictions that we see with alcohol or drugs, it could be overeating, it can be sexual addictions, and the common ones that are frequent. In the clinical setting, those are always secondary addictions. Those are secondary diagnoses because they are not the primary problem. The primary problem is different. The addictive behavior as a secondary diagnosis is a way of avoiding the actual issue. And so let's say my heart has been broken, or I have had a loss in my family, or I've been humiliated, or any kind of a wounding kind of experience. We can reach out to our addictions to avoid our feelings, and that's the intention of the mind. The mind doesn't like the difficulty that we're facing, and so we can retreat into another kind of behavior. So the mind can create any kind of distraction, whether it's a full-blown addiction or not. We oftentimes do that if we have a difficult project, say we're a manager and we have a difficult decision to make. We can avoid that for some time before we just face it. And if we can't face it, of course, then our job's going to suffer. Or if you're a student in college and you have, your midterms coming up, or your final exams and so forth, where you cram, instead of staying up with your homework throughout the semester, students are famous for waiting to the last minute, and they have been avoiding it by doing other things. So this is the kind of thing that the mind can come up with, and there are an infinite number of ways for that to happen. So it's the mind itself that wants to distract itself, and so we need the discipline to stay clear and focused. And if it's a difficult problem, let's say you're going through a divorce, that's not so easy. Or if there's a death in the family, especially a child or a spouse or something like that, that's very painful. And that's why in the theories of Kubler-Ross, she talks about first is we go into denial around death, and then later on we might feel it. But initially we go into denial. And that's a distraction because the enormity of the issue is so great. So that's more like how the mind works when we have something that is difficult to face directly. And if we ingrain that, if we continually avoid difficulty by first taking a drink, for instance. Then we create a dependence on the drink, and then next time difficulty arises, we reach for a drink right away, and we don't even think about it. But the real issue is not this secondary diagnosis, which is, clinically they're called secondary diagnosis. All the addictions are based on secondary diagnosis, meaning that the primary diagnosis is something else. So if my heart is broken, I could drink or I could do drugs to anesthetize. And so when you do any kind of addiction, we can call it self-medicating. Even if it's going shopping and buying something that we don't really need, but we're doing it to make ourselves feel better. That's another form of self-medicating, or having sex with a stranger, and that's another form of anesthetizing to avoid the main feelings. And so whatever the primary thing is, that's what you want to try to get to. And clinically, if you're seeing a therapist or a mentor or a pastor or whoever, the main issue is what you need to eventually start talking about, and then also feeling. So addictions aren't actually real. They're avoidant. In the AA, oftentimes they talk about addictive behavior in terms of drugs or alcohol as a spiritual disorder. And the reason that's said is because the issue they're facing is so deep and so life-changing that it's called a spiritual disorder, and it's more difficult to get into that level. So they need a supportive group and a supportive environment for them to face that. Each of us has philosophical and spiritual issues that we need to face, and typically we have a mentor, and we have a therapist, or we have a spiritual guide of some sort to help us deal with these deeper issues. And once that's done, as we go on that path, then the addictions really get in the way. Addictions do not help our emotional and psychological or spiritual health. They get in the way and interfere with our development. So if you're on a committed path, you want to reduce your addictions, but it's very difficult to reduce them unless you're given some hope that you're actually able, either by yourself or with the help of friends or with professional help, to work with the material that's under the surface that you need to deal with directly. So that's the foundation of addictive acting out. You don't want to get stuck in that kind of pattern. Now, the reason that people relapse so often when they're dealing with, let's say, alcohol addiction or drugs is because they have maybe gone to rehab, and that's a very popular thing for people to do these days, is go on a 30-day rehab, and they think that that's sufficient. But then they come back into their social network that they left, and the stresses of their job are still there and so forth. So they will slowly regress because they haven't dealt with the issue that's underlying that. And there are many levels. Human beings are multidimensional, and the awakening process of a human being is also multidimensional, meaning one level will, let's say level 4, will not affect what's going on down at level 5, but it does help you on level 4, and then before that 3, like that. But if you're, say, wounded at 6 years old, say, then you have to go back into that material, that dealing with 10-year-old issues of the acting out, and if it's based on 6-year-old stuff, then you have to go into 6-year-old stuff and start dealing with your emotional, psychological issues that cause that wound at that level. In depth psychology, it's understood that most of the wounds that we carry go on from start at 0 at birth to 5 years old, and after that we tend to just repeat that pattern, and we get activated later in our life, let's say with abandonment or somebody shaming you or humiliation and so forth. Later on, that gets acted out usually in relationships. But if you go back into the original issue, what you're doing is you're going back to, for you to be there for that hurt little boy or little girl. If you're wounded by your mother, say, or wounded by your father, and of course that happens at every age to some degree or another when we realize that they're not really there for us in all the areas that we want. But they might be good parents, and it might be good enough parenting for you, but it's still going to be insufficient. And it's in the mythological stories, they make this quite clear that it's the parents that break the child's legs. They talk about stories like that it's the mother or the father or both of them breaking your legs and then releasing you to the world where you're crippled. And we can assume that most of us are wounded. And so when we don't know that we're wounded, that's called denial. In the process of psychotherapy or spiritual development, it's not different. We start unfolding those wounded places in us and deal with them directly, rather than self-medicating, rather than avoidant behavior, rather than addictive acting out. And if you go into that material, let's say with your friends, they can help you too to some degree, but they're not going to be able to go down deeper into your childhood and then early childhood material. It's too difficult, and it takes a trained professional to help you stay there in that kind of thing and then work your way through it directly rather than avoidant behavior. So I tell my clients, I ask them what their top 5 addictions are at the start of the therapy, and then I don't say to stop doing that. I ask them to reduce it as much as possible and to as you stop your addictions, as you start reducing the addictions, I should say, more feelings are going to start surfacing. Now, if you have a therapist, then you go to see your therapist and you can make a log during the week. Oh yeah, this bugged me, this hurt me, I had this bad dream. And you take that into the consultation room and work that through emotionally with your therapist. If you don't have a therapist, then you will probably go back to your addictive acting out, to anesthetize, to self-medicate. And we all carry a lot of wounds from 0 to whatever age you are now. For years, year in and year out, and through relationships, these things get acted out terribly. In a romantic relationship, we expect the mate to be there for us. So if I'm the man and I have a female mate, I expect her to be there for me. And of course, she's looking at me and thinking, well, I want you to be here for me. And that becomes a power struggle. Who's going to be here for who? Well, I've had a mother and father, and my mother was wounded, and my father was wounded, and she's had a mother and father, and her mother was wounded, and her father was wounded, and those two people come from different families. So these things get acted out. Who in a family is going to finally raise their hand and say, okay, I'm going to heal? Not many people are willing to do that, and if you do that in your family, let's say a family that's larger, or who's in the family has given you that message. It may not be anybody. Everybody's usually in a state of denial, and if you want to stop the denial, then you have to do your own work. You're probably not going to get a lot of support because nobody else has done it before you, maybe. And if you have had a parent or someone close in your family that has done their work, then of course you might have an ally. But oftentimes it's up to you, and if you want to heal your own self, then you have to decide that you're worth that. And so you have to have enough esteem, enough self-esteem to go, yeah, well, I'm worth working on. I'm going to, instead of taking vacations, I'm going to put my money into my own healing. and that you feel that you're worth that. And that's important to know and acknowledge that you reach out and get the help that you need. So you slow down on all the addictive behavior, watching too much TV, going out with your friends and having a beer and pizza, that kind of thing. You stop acting out, and you focus your energy on the inner journey. You turn your gaze inwardly and turn the mind back on itself. You catch it at the level of mind. If you see the mind wanting to distract itself, then you tame it. You bring it back and you say, okay, I'm going to stay here and work this through. It's important to watch the mind, and because it's the quicker you catch the acting out, the quicker you're going to heal. And if you don't have help, then of course it's a therapist to point that out and catch your own mind and turn it back and say, look here, this is what, when I bring this subject up, you start talking about something else, and so you're distracting. And, then you take that home and you listen and you think about it, because the therapist isn't going to be a malicious person. He's not going to shame you. He's helping you. He's pointing something out. And of course it's going to feel uncomfortable. And there's going to be, at least for the client, a feeling of humiliation, because you're having a witness see the shadow side of you. And that can be embarrassing or humiliating, but of course the therapist has no intention of doing that. It's bringing it out in the open, taking it from the dark side to the sun and let the sun shine on it so that it sort of dries up. So the process of addictions is a slow one, and eventually you'll start dealing more directly with the material, your emotional and psychological material, and the addictions will fall by the wayside as you become healthier. So that's any addiction is like that, and you catch it at the level of mind, and you reduce it. You are able to ask for the help that you need, and you get the help that you need, and you stick with that. Therapy can take X number of years, usually 1, 2, 3, and 4. Like the third and fourth year are generally, very different than the first year, and the second year is different than the first one. So you become more aware and self-realized as you go, and you have to stick with it. So, and there are going to be times when you're not going to want to do that. But I encourage you to think about this and watch your addictions. Get the help that you need as soon as possible. Start reducing them and bring your feelings into a tightly bounded therapeutic professional relationship, so that whatever you go through is heard and appreciated. So this is a talk on addictions and the psychology of addictions, and my name is Robert Teester. And this is part of a series of talks on the cultivation of wisdom, and this is going to be posted online for people to watch whenever they want to. Thank you very much.